Brent?
Thank you, Mark. I feel a little bit like a lemon in the squeezers out there, and they're just going to get every drip of lemon juice out of us. And I'm sure, particularly around the transformation, you're going to hear more than a few times, we just don't know. This is a long process, and there are things that we know now, and we're going to share as much as we can with you, and there are things that we don't know, and that includes also around the agency writ large as it stands now, but we will do our best. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third day of the workshop, of the conference. I don't know about you, but I have been learning a lot, and I've really appreciated the richness of the presentations and the dialogue around the presentations over myriad snacks in the hallway, and it just I'm just so impressed, as wearing sort of the USAID hat, with the level of expertise in the room, the level of commitment, the level of interest and just vibrancy in the room around these issues that we're grappling with. And so we're just so pleased with what we've experienced the last couple of days. And what Elizabeth and I and Joan will facilitate for the third part of this session is a little bit, it's relevant, but it's a little bit off topic. We're going to talk about transformation at USAID, reorganization, transformation, redesign. It's been called many things. I think officially now we're calling it transformation. And as you'll see, and I think you'll appreciate at the end of our time, it is fairly transformative. I mean, what we're doing now is kind of hasn't been done at this scale at the agency in about 20 years. So, so there are, as we get into structure, as we get into priorities, you'll see the connective tissue with why it is we're here, how it is we're structuring ourselves, how it is we're articulating our priorities in the new administration and moving forward, and how that connects with the Office of Food for Peace, humanitarian assistance, resilience, development assistance, sort of writ large, and we'll try to sort of lay out the foundations of how it is we're looking at things at the agency now, and give a snapshot of how we're proposing to structure ourselves moving forward. So I will begin by providing some background on transformation, including some of the underlying motivations and priorities, then offer an overview of the agency's new structure. Elizabeth will follow with further insights into the proposed Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, BHA. And I say proposed because it's not yet approved. This operating unit within USAID, amongst others, is still being considered by Congress by way of a congressional notification, and we're not quite sure when those will be approved, and even if they'll be approved. But we have some pretty good signals moving forward that there's a comfort level on the Hill and support for what it is we're proposing. And then after some Q&A, so we will wait until Elizabeth is done. We'll both take sort of joint Q&A rather than breaking it up in two sessions. Joan will follow by guiding us through some table discussions, wherein we will turn to you for input and advice, including sharing your thoughts on opportunities and challenges born from what we will sort of share with you this morning. So a couple of things before I jump into the meat here. And again, that's a big caveat. A lot of what you're going to see structurally is in terms of the agency structure has of yet been approved by Congress. You know, all of the structure and the functions that we're proposing moving forward. And if and when these are approved by Congress, there's probably a 12 to 18 month period that we anticipate before sort of we'll see sort of fully functional I'm calling them operating units or bureaus or structures within the agency. So, so with respect to your input on opportunities and challenges, despite some description of the new structures going forward and functions to Congress, there's still ample opportunity for input from our partners and USAID staff with respect to kind of what this looks like, how this is really going to be operationalized with respect to processes and modalities, et cetera. So it's a good opportunity, and we really will value your input and look forward to that. And I might remind you that some of your headquarters, I know a number of your organizations, Washington, D.C. staff participated in an all-day retreat with the agency has a transition team that's sort of guiding this process. And I'm going to draw a lot from their slides, but they presented to your headquarters, many of your headquarters staffs in Washington, maybe 3 weeks ago, it was, again, it was a full day, or most of a day's set of presentations from senior USAID staff. So I don't know how that sort of filtered down to those that are outside of DC in the field doing the real work, but so this will be either a reminder or maybe the first time you've sort of been offered some of these insights. So with that, I'd like to begin with a quote from our primary source, the agency's administrator. I'll just press the button here. Yes, good. Administrator Mark Green, in a meeting that he had with staff in August, he shared his vision for the future of the agency and development in general. And I'm going to actually read it to you in parts, and you'll see how each of the components has sort of reflected in what we're seeing moving forward with regard to the agency structure, including the journey to self-reliance, which was referenced the other day, which is again sort of if you have a higher level vision that's guiding a lot of what we do, the journey to self-reliance would be it. And we'll talk a bit more about what that means and how we're measuring it. So just quickly, Administrator Green, and this is really gets to the core of the journey to self-reliance, expressed, I believe the purpose of foreign assistance should be ending its need to exist. And he's, no one's fool. He understands that that's pretty aspirational, but it is an important northern star, a guidepost to sort of gauge what it is we do at the agency moving forward. And what he means by that is each of our programs should look forward to the day when we can end it, meaning foreign assistance. And around the world, we should measure our work by how far each investment moves us closer to that day. Now, I'm under no illusions. In some places, that day is quite a ways off, but we could help our partners by prioritizing programs that show measurable impact, incentivize reform, diversify our partner base, focus on local capacity building, and mobilize their own domestic resources. And in the area of humanitarian assistance, we will always stand with people when disaster strikes or crises emerge. No surprises up there. These are themes and priorities that you incorporate into your programs every day, but to set them out in a cohesive way at the highest level of the agency is really an important reminder to us as we move through this restructure in terms of what we want to look like, how we want to prioritize, and where we're moving towards into the future. So, moving, sort of trying to operationalize that quote and some of the themes. Administrator Green and others have sort of proposed a journey to self-reliance. And what we mean by journey to self-reliance should also not be a big surprise to you. It's quoted, it's defined here as the need for foreign assistance. To end the need for foreign assistance, we must focus on building self-reliance, defined as the ability of a country, including the government, civil society, and private sector, to plan, finance, and implement solutions to solve its own development challenges. This approach must be the cornerstone for how we orient USAID country partnerships. So, again, you see a lot of sustainability in there. You see there's a lot packed in this notion of self-reliance. And again, it's not new to you. I've heard throughout the sessions reference to the Tufts framework on sustainability that largely emerged from fora like these that sort of reminded us that sustainability is more a word. There's a science behind it. There are metrics. There are approaches, and you all have taken that to heart and certainly incorporate and reflect that in your programming. And we also, the agency has established a theory of change to put a little more meat on that definition in terms of how we are going to define, move beyond the definition and sort of measure what it is we're calling self-reliance. And the ways, the theory of change is essentially self-reliance is driven by two closely related elements at a very high level: commitment and capacity. And by commitment, we mean how well a country's laws, policies, actions, and informal governance mechanisms such as customs and norms support progress towards self-reliance. And secondly, capacity, how far the country has come in its journey across the dimension of political, social, economic development, including the ability to work across these sectors. For USAID, this means that a country's commitment and capacity to plan, finance, and implement solutions to solve its own development challenges strengthens, as they strengthen, our partners should also evolve, ensuring that the programs we implement are best supporting a country's journey to self-reliance. So again, no surprises there. These are dimensions of the kinds of programming that we do daily. There's a much more intentional effort around measuring what that means, and you need metrics and measures and targets, et cetera, to be able to sort of not necessarily targets, but measures and data to track how we're doing on this journey, if you will. And so under the broad categories of commitment and capacity metrics, I won't read through them in detail, but there are a number of sort of regularly reported on and public sources of data that I think within the community are generally accepted to measure these 7 dimensions of commitment and capacity. So there's an immediate push within the agency, to establish a baseline, if you will, amongst many low and middle income countries, and that's through a country roadmap process. So the unit of measure here, at the highest level of the agency with respect to this, measuring this dimension, with measuring self-reliance for the agency's purposes, is at the country level, which ideally should be robustly reflect dimensions of, at a subnational level, to some level of accuracy. So this is the way, these country roadmaps are the way that we intend to visualize. They're visualization tool for performance on each of the 17 self-reliance metrics and for assessing countries' overall progress in the journey to self-reliance. A country roadmap will be produced annually for all low and middle income countries and are expected to be publicly available beginning October of beginning this month of this year. So I think our geographic bureaus have been tasked with, with regard to or relative to their particular region, assembling this data and assembling the roadmap. Just quickly, this is just the indicator definition and source sheet on the left. On the right, on the right page, the scatter plot up here, you can't really see a scatter plot, but it's going to demonstrate sort of relative to others in that mix where on the commitment capacity dimensions a particular country lands, and with the sort of the regular updating of these roadmaps, you'll see sort of movement within that scatter plot. There's also on this side, this dimension in the light blue is the commitment dimension, sort of representing those myriad indicators. On the right, it's the capacity dimension. So it's really it's a check-in. It's to see where a country is on its journey towards self-reliance and what sort of where it is relative to its peers. It incites dialogue as appropriate. It informs higher level strategic planning efforts. It's a check-in for us on how we're doing. Again, at the highest level, there's always the attribution issues, and as a sign for where to consider close examination of strategic transition. Again, that's part of prioritization, is where we're investing our funds based on need, and where our USAID funding could be most optimally used to meet development and humanitarian priorities. What's that? Available. What is? Yeah, there's a website that actually is right behind you. USAID.gov / self-reliance, that has sort of a robust, everything I'm telling you in a lot more, in a more coherent way. The resources are available there, including these templates. I don't believe, have they been, they've been completed. Wow, they are fast. Okay, well, tune in, take a look. I'm interested now to look at at what they've determined. But in any event, so good. So we have a baseline, and this is again how we intend to measure and monitor and track how we're doing at that highest level. And there's some issues, certainly. There's imperfect data. We have issues over confusion over the purpose of this. The language, the communication, the terminology, disputes with findings. No country likes to be sort of racked and stacked, if you will, and ranked against others. But I think with the use, complementing this and being open and sort of taking a learning approach, allowing for additional data or secondary data in a uniform way, being clear and tailored in our communication, including with our country partners, and designing flexibility into how it is we use these, and also effective communication with respect to, these are a start of a conversation. It's not to rank prioritize where it is we're going to make investments. It's to start a dialogue. It's to give us some added perspective on where it is we're devoting resources and programming and attention. So, journey to self-reliance. So, this is sort of the backdrop or foundation for a fair bit of what we're doing then as part of this redesign, reorganization, transformation. Drawing from also from the premise that the administrator carries with him, that the world is different now than certainly it was 20 years ago, when our current structures, many of our current structures were established, including the Office of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, within which Food for Peace sits as an office, and the Office of Foreign Disasters sit separate but under that one bureau structure. And some of the characterizations that I've heard with regard to how the world has changed, is sort of motivating or driving some of this introspection, is the nature of development has changed, expectations from the national security team on development has changed, the role of the private sector has increased, American taxpayers expect visible results and progress. We're being asked to show in a more effective way, in a way that is more easily understandable, why these are good investments for the American taxpayer, as well as to certainly our beneficiaries. Arguably the role of the development professional has changed. Certainly there's a strong staff component to this reorganization within USAID in terms of skill sets that we would like to build and structures that we intend to the kind of staff that we intend to work in the new structures. And just the need to be more responsive, agile, and flexible. So within that changing world context, we have a number of sort of key questions that these amongst many others and that we've been asking ourselves, and we would look certainly for your perspective on, and how do we shape ourselves for the next 20 years? How should we position our work? What must we do to recruit the best talent, retain it, strengthen it, empower it? And I would argue that how can we encourage the best talent amongst our partners as well? And then what the agency of tomorrow will look like. So I'm going to take a little bit more than 1 minute. Does that work? Okay. So drawing from that reflection and those key questions, some of the objectives that we've identified to sort of translate this intent, the questions, the higher level visioning, we've sort of put a bit more specificity on them through some key objectives that are guiding the transformation. Better alignment of USAID budget policies and performance, a focus on bilateral programming with more resources and decision making in the field. The administrator really is interested in ways in which we can devolve, move our funding and decision making closer to the field, closer to where it is we are programming and intend to program, closer to our beneficiaries. And inherently that has a big influence on structure and internal operations. Strengthen the agency's coordination with the interagency, private sector, and other donors to achieve greater results. Focus on locally led development, no surprise there. Utilize co-creation, co-design, co-financing, along with innovative financing approaches to create greater outcomes and results. We're really, and we'll get into this a little bit when we look at the structure, we're being asked to and challenged to collaborate better within the agency amongst ourselves. I mean, we're good bureaucrats and we guard our boxes and our resource pools. And the nature of this conference around resilience is multi-dimensionality, multifaceted programming, looking beyond, carpenter with a hammer. No, you're creating a house. You need a full set of skills and expertise, and that requires us to sort of work differently together. And I think the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance is a tremendous example of where two very separate offices now are being brought together and challenged to improve our efficiency and effectiveness and collaboration to achieve our objectives. In that regard, better coordinate humanitarian conflict and resilience. Resilience. So that's a real strong theme coming through what we're hearing from the agency, and I think it's the right one. And Elizabeth will talk about how those structures, not just humanitarian, but how across these themes we're coming together. Leveraging foreign assistance to advance national security priorities while advancing partner countries in their journey to self-reliance. So Mark, I think at the opening the other day, with respect to sort of this priority around humanitarian conflict and resilience, highlighted, and this is part of the world is changing dimension here. Mark highlighted, I think in 2017, almost 124 million people across 51 countries face crisis levels of food insecurity or worse, including pre-famine, and there were pockets of famine. And that's a dramatic increase from 2015, where there's 80 million. So 80, 124, generally using the same measures and metrics to calculate those numbers. So shocks, stresses, and crises are increasing also in frequency and intensity around the globe, necessitating a new way of doing business amongst us. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we've been thinking, what's been driving us with respect to the transformation to date. That's translated into some structures, which I'll show you in a minute. There's a cadence here I talked about. Once these operating units, these separate congressional notifications are approved by the Hill, there's certainly, it's not an overnight thing, even though we've been doing as much as we can without the reorganization being fully being officially sanctioned. But when it is, we intend to really dig in deep, sort of operationally and process-wise, with these the existing units, which are melding and forming and shifting into the new structure. And I think that's going to be a heavy lift through presuming the approval from Congress in the near term. In the fall and spring, again with sort of a different cadence depending on a different box and the complexity of what it is we're doing in each of these new bureaus over again the next year and a half. This should be relatively familiar. It's the current agency structure, the agency's front office and the red box, and different core functions, finance and CIO, et cetera. Then we have what we call the core functions around budget and human capital, et cetera, and security. And then in the light blue, the functional offices, sort of the non-geographic offices, of which the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, DACHA is one, Global Health, et cetera. The blue boxes are central bureaus, sort of our policy planning bureau, our management bureau, our legislative public affairs, et cetera. And then under that are our regional bureaus, with one office being the Office of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then certainly our field missions overseas. So that should be relatively familiar to you. Our Office of Food for Peace, again, is in the third light blue box. So this is the proposed structure. And there's estimates that it'll sort of directly impact close to 3,000 USAID staff, and arguably the largest restructuring in 20 years. So the first major thing this set of restructuring proposals attempts to do is to bring all like functions under one official operating unit or official process. By aligning our core capacities, we'll take sort of the first step towards strengthening them to meet some of these objectives that we laid out. The big changes there are changes throughout, but what's wrapped in yellow, I think, is particularly notable. And you can see the new Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance in this new structure under a separate sort of administrative unit led by an associate administrator that Elizabeth will get into, tying again these functions of conflict, humanitarian assistance, resilience, food security together in a much more intentional way. The reason the Asia Bureau, not a lot of change in our geographic bureaus. Asia Bureau is highlighted because the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs, AWAPA, is now being wrapped into Asia Bureau. So that's the big change in your region. And then some other shifts in terms of staffing and resource and policy and planning and our management bureau are a big part of this reorganization. So with that, I hope I've shed a little added light. I threw a lot at you. This reflects over a year of sort of very focused work amongst many in the agency, and again, we kind of look at this as the start of the process, and again, your input and insights will be tremendously useful today, particularly around the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. So I will pass the mic to Elizabeth, and she'll shed some more light on that particular structure. Thank you.
So I think, thanks to Brian. He gave a really great, I think, overview of what we've been working on at USAID for the last year or so, quite extensively, actually, even within for the proposed, thank you, Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, the two offices of Food for Peace and Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. We've been meeting our leadership teams on a weekly basis since last fall. In preparation for this and trying to inform the process and think about where this could lead and how this could really elevate and enhance our capabilities across the humanitarian and development field. I can talk a little bit about, before I get into the BHA specifically, Brian had mentioned the three bureaus under the Associate Administrator for Relief, Response, and Resilience. And I doubt that it's really any shock to anyone why these three might be placed together. The types of complex environments that we're working in now, the situations we're in, how we need to respond. There was a lot of good discussion, I think 2 days ago, in a response analysis side meeting that talked about sort of the complexity of the situations. We have people that might be receiving, urgent humanitarian relief while they're still suffering from chronic food insecurity, and it's not really a linear process, and people are going in and out of these situations, and you might have communities experiencing all three at the same time. It could be from, natural onset disasters, could be exacerbating certain fragilities in communities, population displacements, conflict, obviously, can further destabilize communities who might already be suffering from basic needs and other vulnerabilities. So the idea is to have these three bureaus working together to really try and coordinate and strengthen our approach and response to countries, basically, and to what's needed in a country. So really looking at a country and a region in some cases as well. How are we all programming together? How is the range and the breadth of our congressional mandates, notwithstanding on the Food for Peace and OFTA side, the global food security strategy, how can we combine all of these things a little more collaboratively, strategically, and align them better to better respond to some of the situations that we find ourselves in. You all are operating in these environments every day. We heard from the Rohingya situation in Myanmar and Bangladesh yesterday. So we all know that this is very real, and this is the agency's attempt to really try and better position ourselves so that together with all of our partners, which are all of you, to create more durable solutions for these complex problems. So the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, as we'll have countering violent extremism, Office of Military Coordination, the Office of Transition Initiatives, they will all go into that bureau. So really looking at sort of the urgent side of the conflict spectrum, noting that many of the countries where we've been working in famine or famine-like situations for the past 2 years, many of those are in fact due to conflict or have been exacerbated by conflict in a very real way. The Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, I'm sure that some of your headquarters staff and perhaps some of you have been listening to some of the sessions. I know that the associate administrator for the Bureau for Food Security, Beth Dunford, has gone out and met with Interaction and some other partners to talk about how they're restructuring their bureau. That's the most important link to think about with that bureau is they're really elevating resilience within that bureau. So it is now the Resilience and Food Security Bureau, really looking at how can the objectives and of the Feed the Future and with agriculture-led growth, how can we better connect those to some of the areas where we're experiencing recurrent humanitarian crises? We know that, within Food for Peace, and in particularly Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA, we really work with very, very vulnerable populations, that have just recently been hit by natural disaster or are affected by complex crises or complex disasters, slow onset. Whereas the Feed the Future program is really looking at sort of those middle market people that maybe have some capabilities that they can take advantage of the market structures or take advantage of improved legislation and laws that will enable private sector growth and their businesses to grow, things like that. So it's really how do we create those linkages and put those two together a bit more so that we really do have some kind of transition between the humanitarian side to this longer term development side of USAID. And then within the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and of course I'll let you, we'll have questions after this for anything, but for the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, so as I said, that's combining OFDA and Food for Peace. I had someone mention the other day that, wow, this is a big move. I mean, these brands are well known, and it is true. Food for Peace has been around since 1954, OFDA's been around since 1964. I mean, these are known brands, and not just that, there's a lot of respect and engendered for their operational effectiveness and our capacity and what we represent for the U.S. government and how we represent ourselves overseas. And that's something that we're very cognizant of, that we do not want to lose. But with the opportunity to restructure, we really have some added advantages and some gains that I think everyone in this room is well aware of. When we talk through it. Specifically. Let me just open this. So a couple of years ago in 2016, there was a group, McKinsey and Company, who did a study, and some of you might have heard about this, that the U.S. government, USAID, commissioned in order to look at the two offices. So combining, within this whole restructuring and the transformation at USAID, combining the Office of Food for Peace and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance has been something that's been talked about for a really long time. And so this is not, anything new for many people. How we do it, when we do it, what does it look like? Those are some of the questions that have sort of been batted around for the past few years. When the McKinsey and Company study was finished, it represented a couple of different options, or presented a couple of options for management. And what was chosen was actually to enhance our coordination for the short term, but actually to really, the long-term objective would be to combine these capabilities, recognizing that sort of the bifurcation of food and non-food within the same populations that we're addressing really doesn't make sense. It's not economical, it's not efficient, we're not creating holistic strategies to address these situations. It's confusing for partners, multiple different grants, and it really sort of limits ourselves as a U.S. government in our humanitarian voice, because we have a lot of different people coming to the table. And so it was something that most people understood would happen at some point, and now that's what we're seeing. As Brian said, this is with the Hill. It's been presented as a congressional notification with all of the other proposed new bureaus within USAID. But the idea is that this really can enhance the full spectrum of what we're able to do. So when we're looking at disaster relief, when we're looking at early response to a situation that's getting worse, maybe that we're already working in, when we're looking at recovery settings, and when we're looking at transitional food security activities, what we now call our DIFSAs, when we're looking at some of those linkages and understanding that people are not just in one bucket usually or the other, that they really are sort of mixing around all of those depending on what's happening in their country. It gives us a new opportunity. So when we think about what we can do within OFDA and Food for Peace and coming together to talk about a certain country, we can actually really look at that full spectrum of programming and all the capabilities that we do have, all the resources that we do have to really structure a response that's a lot more holistic, that really accounts for day 0 to 18 months, whatever is needed. And then in the sense of our more Title II development programs, I mean, looking more further into that. But it also gives us the chance to operate with one voice in terms of how do we better position communities? How do we help them recover from crisis? How do we help mitigate crises? How do we help build their resilience? How do we help prepare them and give them that foundation that they need so that they can transition with hope to other programs that will provide long-term stability? So whether that be USAID programs such as Feed the Future, or opportunities with other USAID mission activities and other donors and what countries are doing themselves. Like how can we better look at countries and look at the populations that we're serving to really better prepare them to take advantage of the private sector opportunities, maybe changes in government legislation that's allowing greater access or greater mobility or business startup support. So really, it gives us a better foundation, I think, for doing that and to look at that holistically and to really pull in people and say, hi, we're responding to this emergency, but really this is a health systems issue. We really need more staff at the local level. This is a big issue. Or, these farmers, we can provide them with some emergency seed, but there's not a functioning seed market. We're not able to just get seed from the neighboring country because the laws aren't harmonized and the legislation isn't harmonized. So it's really us being able to also, as a humanitarian bureau, reach out better and advocate for more resources or more legislation changes or better private sector involvement and really try to bring others in to address some of these long-standing problems that we've been in year after year and decade after decade. Within the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, yeah, I'm going to go to that. Okay. So this is proposed, notional. But basically, when looking at combining OFTA and Food for Peace, we could have gone the easy route. We could have just, had one new bureau with 2 offices. That would have been easy, but it wouldn't really have achieved anything that we really want to achieve. The greater humanitarian voice, that ability to operate more effectively, that ability to be more efficient, and that ability to be more holistic in terms of our programmatic and technical approach, and definitely more strategic overall. The new bureau will have will be housed again within the Relief, Recovery, and Resilience Associate Administrator. We will have 3 Deputy Assistant Administrators under our administrator for our bureau, and then we'll have 8 offices. So you can see these here. We'll have 3 geographic-based offices, 2 offices that will be handling different aspects of policy and partnerships, understanding that within the humanitarian sphere, this is very broad and very complex, especially when we think about the types of resources we have. With Title II, we're dealing with different committees and partners, committees on the Hill within our Congress, but also partners in the United States and suppliers and things. So it really requires a more robust response, really trying to advocate more with the private sector in the U.S. as well, to partner with them in terms of humanitarian operations. So the 2 offices of policy, one is Policy Programs and Partnerships, if you're having trouble reading it, and the other is the Office of U.S. Partnerships and Strategic Communications. We have the Office of Technical and Program Quality, so that will be combining OFTA's technical experts with Food for Peace's, the division that I'm acting chief of right now, the Technical Assistance Learning and Planning Division. So combined, we'll have over 23, 24 different technical specialists covering different sectors. We'll have the famine early warning system, along with the hydro-meteorological and the disaster side of the house that OFTA brings to the table in terms of looking at earthquakes, preparing communities, looking at urban planning, different things like that. It has our design teams and our learning, really understanding the importance, and we've talked about that really a lot, and what TOPS is all about is really linking the aspects of implementation with technical quality, how are we learning, how are we incorporating that back into our designs, how are we incorporating that back into our programs. We actually had a bit of a conversation about that you know, we did not want to split those. We really saw that the fact that having those housed into one office is really critical for learning and really helps us, helps our program quality overall. There'll be the Office of Field and Response Operations. So that's basically combining all of the non-food items, the logistics side of the house that OFTA does with our food, our division that houses, deals with all the commodities, works with Kansas City and the suppliers. And then we have the Humanitarian Business and Management Operations, which is just our administration, training, relationships with other USG entities. We have a lot of agreements with other USG partners in order to fulfill our work both operationally and technically. So, so I think since we went over a little bit, I think what I will do is stop so that we can have some questions. I think that might be the best use of the time for now. But I think that overall, I mean, we are pretty excited about the new Bureau. I mean, there's a lot of concerns, there's a lot of change for both entities. I mean, we'll have over 800 staff. And so having, you know, going through an organizational change of that size for us is pretty significant considering the mandates and the types of management structures we even have that support the different operational modalities, you know, our operational capabilities. And so trying to recognize all that to make sure that we have the good from both sides and creating a new Bureau. But it really will better enable us to have that voice and that leadership capability. We heard from the folks yesterday and covering Cox's Bazar and the Rohingya crisis that, you know, having that donor voice is really helpful, and this really will help to solidify and keep our message high and keep that priority on our message because it will be one message. And so that's a pretty exciting opportunity that I think that we are looking forward to. So anyway, thank you for your time, and we can go to questions.
So, there are mics circulating. Be kind to us. We know what we know. And certainly questions on anything we've gone over today, and if there are other broader Food for Peace or even agency questions, we can opine as we're able. Don't be bashful. Is this a good idea? Does it make sense? Anything jump out at you as crazy? Concerning opportunities?
I just have a question about the degree to which a country will participate in its own roadmap. You have that lovely diagram up there, and I'm wondering how participatory that process is and how that evolves with USAID and a country looking together at the country's capacity and capacity building needs.
Okay, I can start real quick.
Sure.
Just the intent of the roadmap is, or the process for crafting the roadmap is publicly available data and measures and indices. Where we really look to have a close intersect with countries is in our strategic planning processes. Including our country level 5-year, multi-year planning processes known as the CDCS, which is country-based planning for the full USAID portfolio. Within our DIFSAs, for example, drilling down to the Food for Peace level, wherein it has to be very reflective of country priorities and involve country and local stakeholder input, and then there are very strategic planning processes and collaborative mechanisms and structures in between and around. So this journey to self-reliance roadmap is more of a tool for us, again, drawing from easily accessible consensus measures, which I haven't studied these in detail, I presume rely on government data in some degree. So So it's less a planning process that rightly should include our partners than it is just a reflection of kind of how things are going based on what we deem to be important, and to regularly check in through that process. Does that make sense?
I could add to that a little bit. One thing I didn't mention, I think but it's very much related to the country roadmaps, but in a different way. For USAID, when we look at especially the 3 bureaus, but really the whole agency, when we look at different sectors that we're trying to move the needle on, right? We're trying to improve our metrics. They haven't always been as coordinated and as aligned in terms of strategy and implementation as they could be. So if you take, something like nutrition, we have a couple of different bureaus that operate in nutrition across the range of spheres, from development to the food security, the Title II programs that we do, to emergency programming. And we know through recent research on wasting, on stunting, that it's not that simple. We can't delineate between emergency and development anymore, that we really have to take a more holistic view. And so the agency is moving towards looking at sectors both strategically and then looking at countries and how can we work more collaboratively in different countries with our different funding streams in order to really move progress on certain sectors, whether, from our perspective, it's mostly on the capacity side, I would say, of the journey to self-reliance, but it also will be on the commitment side when we're looking at how do we create some of those durable changes within systems, both formal and informal, and through the private sector that can really move people and reduce the level of humanitarian need. So we have a couple of inter-bureau collaboration structures that Brian just referred to that we'll be looking at trying to do this more broadly, looking at water, resilience, nutrition, among a few. So this will help us to work together more broadly in Washington, more collaboratively in Washington, but really through the field and through the mission strategic plan that Brian just mentioned, and some of the regional plans that we also have. So really trying to bring together some of our conversations so that we aren't planning separately and we can actually plan hopefully early on in the beginning. All of this will take time, but the intent is to be more strategic in terms of where we put our budget resources and how we use them to collectively move certain metrics in countries that we're very interested in or concerned about.
Elizabeth reminds me of the regional food security strategies under the Global Food Security Act, and then the Global Food Security Strategy, U.S. government interagency effort to bring together different resource pools and expertise, and with amongst the U.S. government and our partners in tight collaboration with country governments to develop multi-year strategies that don't just focus specifically on aid interests. They incorporate USDA, they incorporate MCC. So that's one dimension is sort of where we fall together with the interagency, and that's often reflected in the Feed the Future initiatives, which are tightly coordinated with host country priorities and bring the Bureau for Food Security and Food for Peace increasingly closer together under the sort of the guise of that GFSS dimension.
I think Julia had someone, right?
Yes, I'm Sagar from Mercy Corps. So I'm already seeing, because there are these different bureaus that you have stated here. One is the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, the other one is Resilience and Food Security. I'm already seeing a lot of interconnections between them. So one could be, you've stated here that we are going to work through after on earthquakes around through humanitarian assistance, but then this is so much interconnected to resilience because you have to not only build response capacities, but also long-term sustainability efforts around resilience if you're talking about earthquakes and different shocks and stresses. So interconnections different offices? How does these things work together when different offices are?
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I will call out one of our colleagues here, Arif Rashid. He's sitting over there. The resilience programming, the Resilience Center is housed currently in the Bureau for Food Security, and obviously the prominence and the elevation of that within resilience and food security under the new proposed structure is highlighting that need and highlighting basically those linkages between what I was talking about earlier, that longer ag-led growth that's really hitting, populations that are a bit more stable, that might have land or might have, better access to land and capabilities to engage in more productive livelihood and economic strategies. On the resilience side, we have been tracking resilience for years. I would say about 70% of the Resilience Center programming that you see that's reported on through USAID's website and through the Resilience Coordinator, Greg Collins, those are Food for Peace programs. So we're doing it. We've been doing it for a long time, and it's definitely very much a part of what we do. To us, it's very much linked with sustainability and just good development practices, and really looking at how do we better prepare people so that they are more stable, so that they can, for lack of a better word, transition, to more viable, durable solutions in the long term. But recognizing the linkages there is really recognizing that working at the community levels, building community capacities, whether it's households or maybe the local governance structures or informal structures, it takes more than that, right? I mean, we do need policies, we do need legislation, we do need good governance, we do need education. So it's really trying to link all of those and realize how can we better position those truly most vulnerable populations that we are working with in Food for Peace and in OFTA, and really better help them transition and create the environments within their countries so that they really can move themselves out of poverty, ideally. I hope that helped.
We had a question right up here, Agnes.
Sorry, I've been told I'm to introduce myself this time. My name is Angie. I work with Catholic Relief Services. And I guess my question really was, you talk a lot about that integration between the two new bureaus, the humanitarian assistance and the resilience and food security, and with the leveraging then of their work for the national security priorities. I'm just wondering, are we then to expect that the Food for Peace countries will be realigned to the Feed the Future countries? Especially those where there are more slow onset chronic food security issues, but not necessarily the conflict side of things? And how exactly will that move forward with the DFSAs?
That's a great question. So for the most part, Food for Peace countries are already fall under the rubric of the Global Food Security Act and Feed the Future. So we're either working in some of their target countries or their aligned countries. There's very little that falls outside of that. I think the aligned countries right now cover 28 or 34, so it's pretty broad. I think when we're talking about how do we more closely align, it's really looking at what is the need, right? On the humanitarian side, and even within our Title II development funds, we're really looking at the most vulnerable, and we're really looking at need and trying to respond to that need. And so that will always be our primary objective, is really looking at those populations and addressing those in the best way we can through the range of programming and funds that we do have, if it's disaster assistance funds or Title II funds. We already program very closely with the Bureau for Food Security, with our community development funds, which many of you are familiar with, and that's really how we do have a collaboration. And we're working with them very closely as they're building up and thinking about how to better structure and better strategically form their new resilience focus. We're working with them even more closely. So the objectives are aligned and the same. I mean, we really want to move people, we want to reduce the humanitarian need, and we really want to address the complex problems that countries are facing in a more holistic way.
And I think to your allusion to increasingly targeting areas in crisis or conflict, Probably. Yeah. I think we're just out of necessity and where the majority of our resources are going, including humanitarian assistance, really being called to address some of the really sticky issues in those environments to which we could, offer some value and improve people's resilience and reduce levels of conflict, hopefully as a byproduct. And so I think all signs are sort of pointing in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the Cox's Bazaar is a perfect example. Some of the issues that were highlighted yesterday, the concerns of the host community, the fact that the youth aren't really targeted. I mean, that's something that really is elevated and important for us when we're thinking about how these 3 new bureaus work together. I mean, obviously food security and humanitarian need is inextricably linked with some of the potential conflict or the pathways for conflict. So it's something that I think that we will be, this is, I think, affording us a better opportunity to really work more closely and not just address and look at our sector, but really try to think about it more holistically.
So we have one more question right here, and Virginia, if you can take the microphone to the other side, the gentleman in the back.
Hi, I'm Rakesh Kettle. I work for World Vision in Bangladesh. And my question is related to this, the transformation that you are looking at, and the FFP getting into the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. Now, the DIFSAs basically are falling under this. So when we are talking about this is essentially a development programming. So are we looking at then really changing the title of this? Like this is no longer going to be the development food security assistance activity? And in terms of looking at the focus of this activity, is it because there's lots of work that we do is essentially development, it's not humanitarian assistance as such. So what is the thinking going forward in terms of what would be the key priorities? Are you seeing some major shifts in the objective and the priorities under the FFP programming for the DIFSAs going forward?
Just on DIFSA, if you can think of a good acronym, we'll take it. We worked hard at IDEAL, Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
We're not changing, right? But where we work is changing. And we have this sort of dichotomy of emergency and development that we've created ourselves, and we know it's not that clean, right? We know that it's very mixed and it's asymmetrical, it's nonlinear. I mean, there's a lot of things about the space that we work in. And so what we are really looking at is how do we think a little bit differently about approaching that problem set and not just approach it saying, I'm going to go do an emergency program. Okay, now I'm going to go do a DIFSA. We know that it's just not that simple anymore. And so when we're looking at a new bureau, how do we think about that differently and realize that those are names that don't actually completely exist. Now, with regard to the types of interventions though and what we do, this foundational development, what the DIFSA does, is very much a part of Food for Peace, and it will be very much a part of the new bureau. I mean, we still are working through those programs with populations that, for the most part, are rarely ever reached with other parts of USAID, and so that will not go away. We consider that a very much, an important part of the populations that we serve. Their vulnerabilities, the susceptibility they have to shocks, and other forms of conflict or crisis that may hit them. And so those populations are still very much a part of what we do. That type of work is still very much a central tenet of what we do.
So we'll go to Virginia, and then Juliet, there was a gentleman in the back here.
Okay, I'm Abdul Rahman from USAID Food for Peace, Pakistan. I have one question and one comment. First is about, Elizabeth, you shed a light on the inter-bureau collaboration and then the sectors which you are thinking that they have a cross-cutting themes and we can work out. Have you really thought of or envisioned those practical coordination challenges which have an overlap on the mandates of the 3 bureaus, which the 3 bureau will be definitely coming up. Are you really envisioning those practical coordination challenges in your future programming, like how they will be sorted out while you would be a new bureau? And second question is more on the tech, really on the field side, like how do you see that this change will have a positive or negative effect on the field offices, especially the Food for Peace and of the staff? Thank you.
So clearly our challenge is to improve our support to and the effectiveness of our field structures, missions and what are now sort of the separate OFTA Food for Peace platforms, and sort of evolving how we in Washington and in its component parts, including within the new bureau and sort of in a cross-sectoral, cross-bureau manner, support our missions. And that's very, very intentional at this point. And we know also that our USAID country mission leadership is set that expectation out very clearly for us. And so we're in active dialogue internally within the Office of Food for Peace and OFDA as a proposed new unit, and also in outreach to our field mission colleagues, such as yourself, and including mission directors, around how to meet our core mandates, which aren't going away, they're evolving. The need for a hyper-capable immediate response capability that's sort of reflected in OFDA and Food for Peace right now on the emergency response side, to providing excellent Washington-based technical assistance to the missions on a variety of food security, emergency, DRR, et cetera, themes, all of the nutrition themes, all of which will be embodied in the new bureau. So that's a work in progress, but it is our intent and pledge to concentrate more of that capability and expertise in the field. Now, an interesting corollary is, how do you get 2 decades-old institutions that really do what they do well to work as one culturally, operationally, from a human resource standpoint? We have OFTA reps in the field, we have Food for Peace reps in the field. What I can say to start, despite some cultural and mandate differences, is the collaboration amongst OFTA and Food for Peace. We're co-located now. I don't know if you all knew that. In Washington, we're sitting next to one another as a start to this process already. The intent is really positive. It's very positive, and we're building relationships. We're beginning to speak a common language, and not that we didn't before, but we're learning about non-food. They're learning about food, and so there's an interesting conversation around, what does a humanitarian officer look like? We have a Food for Peace officer. We have an OFDA emergency operations specialist. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're starting to, people will remain specialized in what they do, but we're also looking at, or setting expectations. We intend to set greater expectations for our staff to be able to work across even this totality of 3 big basket themes: humanitarian, food, non-food, conflict, and resilience. So as a USAID professional, it's exciting. It's an exciting opportunity to build your skill set, to look at the problem in a new and more sophisticated way, to offer new services, either being based at the mission or based in Washington, to address some of these sticky challenges. But it's kind of an I don't know question at this point, because we're really looking at kind of what that looks like from a human resource standpoint and structural standpoint but the intent and expectation is clear that we're going to look different in the field. It's going to be more field focused, and we expect to just enhance our capacity, certainly from a Washington and field platform perspective, to meet the needs of the mission and our host country requirements or requests. You have anything to add? Okay.
Okay, we're going to go to Mara, and then we'll go to Julia.
Okay, Mara Russell from CARE. So my question is a little bit around the initial, going back to the scatter plots on commitment and capacity. And wondering whether, and as you said, there are going to be some metrics, et cetera. To what extent will those actually be integrated into programming in terms of objectives, what shall I say, outcomes, desired outcomes and impacts that we'll be working towards in the future? And you know, certainly also thinking about that, given some of the constraints that exist that we're focusing on in some of our programs, particularly in humanitarian and the DFAP programs, which, you know, we probably would not have these types of programs if it weren't for those. What would be the expectations or the level of expectation around that? And to what extent would that play into an overall strategy for the agency?
That's a great question, and arguably I don't have a very precise answer, because this is new and it is at this point intended to guide and start conversations at the highest level of the agency, stemming from the administrator's very clear mandate to us to build self-reliance. And so we begin to look at seminal documents and the clues and hints that we have thus far to kind of see what that means. So I think what is clear is everything we do is going to have to somehow relate to that conversation and demonstrate progress towards, it's not, you know, it's not a heavy lift. I mean, what we do does build capacities, et cetera, build self-reliance. What's not clear, and this is, you know, it's a tool. It's you know, I think everybody realizes it's not perfect. It's constrained by the data. It's very high level, but it's a, you know, it's sort of a general picture of how we're doing at a country level, and where we work is often subnational and much more nuanced. But so it's not clear whether, you know, the RIP will be, you know, incorporate, you know, X and Y measure into what it is you're doing, food for peace non-emergency partner, because we want to relate it directly back up to this higher level set of measures. My guess is it won't be that explicit. My guess is that we as professionals need to understand what it is we're doing and its relationship to our higher level objectives, and be sure we can tell that story, but not compromise our more nuanced and specific measures at you know, relative to our programming. So it's, you know, it's kind of a gray area at this point.
Yeah. So I mean, to add to what Brian said, I mean, we have, as he already mentioned, the global food security strategies for the countries. We have our food for peace strategy. We have the multi-sectoral nutrition strategy. Those are still our guiding documents, and we're really looking at in nutrition conversations, okay, how do we look at all of these documents and really think about what we're doing and where we're doing it and how we're doing it strategically? Are we really working together to move a certain metric? So, I mean, as Brian said, that these are sort of meant to sort of guide us and be a conversation so that we can look at that. But right now, it's not intending to supplant in any of the existing strategies that have been well thought out and well accepted within USAID and the community writ large.
Julia.
All right. Good morning. My name is Walter with Care Bangladesh. Just a quick question from an operational point of view as a DIFSA implementer. I think one of the things that we've heard repeatedly is that the DIFSAs are really community level sorts of activities. Now, in many countries, that may overlay with Feed the Future or other US government programming, but it's not always the case. The reality is then oftentimes we get into what I'd call probably a mandate conversation about, is that something that a DIFSA should do or should someone else be doing it? Those often become constraints when we see clear opportunities as implementers to engage potentially in advocacy work or higher systems engagement. So the question I would have is, will this structure create that opportunity for us when there is when the chance or the the opportunity presents itself? Can we move up to that, or are we going to be more constrained given that you kind of have now almost relief response resilience sounds a little more to the lower side than when we had the development conversations on there. So I'm not sure whether that's precise in terms of question, but then I have a second part to it, which is, do we then see if the opposite then happens, that we cannot move up, then are we likely then to be seeing a tightening of the context or the countries in which then we would be programming these types of programs, just because we cannot cross that divide? Thank you.
I knew he'd ask a difficult question.
Those are great questions. I mean, we talked a little bit, right, about this yesterday. With respect to your first question, I mean, we already spoke a little bit this morning about that we really are already aligned. When we're looking at our country selection process for the past year or 2 years, we basically start with the GFSS countries, so we're already aligned. I think, again, it goes to where is our operational mandate, what are our funds meant to do that we have been provided with by the administration and Congress, and what is our capacity. What I think is very unique and exciting to me with the new bureau and the new way that we can look at some of these situations is where do we see some of those more systemic issues that might exist that really might need to change in order to really move populations into a better place, reduce their poverty levels, reduce their nutritional needs, or improve their nutrition, improve their education, things like that. I think this is where we reach out to other partners who are operating in that country. We reach out to other the USAID mission and try to understand what else is going on, who is working at other levels. I think it's not to say that there will be a constraint, but I would say that we do still have the Bureau for Food Security, or the Resilience and Food Security Bureau, that really does have a different kind of mandate and has more experience and expertise to work on some of those longer term development issues. I mean, really changing legislation, things like that. I think that where we have a strong role is to advocate for certain changes that we might see that may be creating some of the humanitarian burden that we do see in our countries. Some of the poverty issues, some of the nutritional issues that we see that we're trying to respond to. So I think that there's no fixed answer, so I'm sorry to say that, but I think that we do have an opportunity to be more engaged in that conversation. But does it mean that a DIFSA or a R2D or a DFAP or whatever they've been called, over the many years, they've had many names for many different reasons, is I think recognizing who we are, who we really work with, and what our operational capacities are with respect to that. So I hope that.
I think just to add to that in terms of expectation, and it's reflected structurally. The expectation is a greater requirement to co-program, to co-design, to layer, sequence, etc. on our Food for Peace portfolio, on our Food for Peace non-emergency resources, as that expectation is placed on across the set of Feed the Future partnerships. And there's a, in terms of country selection, we engage our BFS, soon to be RFS colleagues in that conversation, with the expectation that when we do move forward in procuring services and designing programs, that those that are looking at those problem sets, which will ultimately sort of manifest themselves in grants and activities and programs, have had those conversations and can articulate those linkages and why they've chosen certain geographies and why, why optimally there's complementarity across different kinds of programming and different kinds of resources addressing common problems.
And we've been, to add, we've been doing this for a while. We've been testing it out and piloting it and trying to improve. And there have been some successes and there have been some lessons learned. In Guatemala, there was a lot of co-programming, trying to layer and sequence some of the different funding streams with the different capabilities, knowing that, one bureau, one office can't do everything at every level within a governance structure, within a country. So if you look at the Sahel, we've been doing programming for a while. Northern Kenya and Guatemala, there was some. So we're in a lot of countries, we're already looking at that, but what we're trying to do is really link and say, these people, they need better markets. But in order to have better markets, they need fertilizers and inputs, and the regulations at the national level don't allow for those to be imported. So can you please help us do that? So I think recognizing that we all work together, we all don't do everything, right?
Mark?
Mark Fritzler with TOPS. I'm just interested in, this has been a wonderful opportunity to learn what we can so far about this transformation that you're experiencing and will be rolling out in various forms over the next many months, or even not a year plus. My question, I guess, is TOPS has had the honor and the privilege of being able to be a public engagement mechanism with the Office of Food for Peace, and there's been a significant openness and willingness to engage through that mechanism and engage with the public, the community of practice, as this gathering indicates as well. And we've been pleased to be able to assist in things such as public consultations. For example, in the rollout of the build up to and then the rollout of the new long-range strategy for the Office of Food for Peace. We had quite a few opportunities for the public to engage with yourselves over this. And so what I'm looking at is this certainly is a much more broad and comprehensive fruit basket upset, and it would be interesting to know what forms of mechanisms you're thinking of in terms of engaging the public and informing the public about how this whole thing will now work. Is the overall agency, in terms of USAID, has that been a consideration, or have you already thought about that in terms of the bureau level? Because you'll have one bureau that's had a lot of experience with the TOPS-like mechanism, the other one hasn't as much, part of the bureau. And so I'm just curious, what would you like to envision? And I think, obviously the follow-on mechanism for TOPS it would be an available opportunity, but it had been focused up to now on things like the Food for Peace mandates. But this looks like there's going to be a bigger need for more public consultation across a broader range of interests. So I'm just curious if there's been discussions on how to do that, how to roll out these public engagement mechanisms and what they might look like.
Those are great questions, Mark. And I know, as you know, within Food for Peace, we really value the learning and the ability to learn from each other and to integrate that into our programming. I think you had two different questions, if I'm understanding really, and the first one was more of outreach in terms of external and how are we going to engage partners. The administrators already had a series of meetings and talked with different groups at different levels, and we will soon, we hope as well. But really, to think about those sorts of questions and to figure out how do How do we learn, the opportunities that this different sort of construct presents? How do we better, engage in that learning side of it and exchange side of it? What I will say is that we're already doing that in a lot of places. I mean, we have co-learning mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms in different countries. Through the multi-sectoral nutrition strategy, that's funding from a lot of different bureaus and offices, including Food for Peace. So we're already looking at opportunities and engaging in those in terms of thinking through how we can jointly learn and jointly collaborate to adapt, to have better effective programs. I mean, I think I'm not giving you a very specific answer, but a very important aspect of the administrator's new agenda and the journey to self-reliance is really a commitment to do better, to really look at ourselves and how we're doing programming, how are we structured internally to maximize what we're doing and to ensure that we're really putting our resources strategically in the right way, and how are we programming better. And so, there's a lot of interest, from our side and from across the agency in terms of looking at the programs and making sure that we're really doing them effectively and we're really learning. So asking those hard questions and making sure that we're asking them of ourselves every day. So it's not really just an internal, it's both of us in partnership trying to make sure that we are moving those metrics as we need to, and how can we do it better and how can we learn from that to improve for the future.
Julia?
Thank you. My name is Bakkala. I work for Catholic Relief Service. My question is this. 3 days I was hearing about priorities with all the sectors. And just what I want to say is when I have experience where we use funding from Food for Work, Food for Peace program and emergency program OFDA, especially in Ethiopia, most of INGOs used to implement this one, where we changed the life of the people from emergency to development. For instance, when you say priority with Food for Peace, within that, WASH is limited. When you go to OFDA emergency section, you get OFDA, but the targeting, the areas, geographic area mostly, OFDA is going away where emergency is there. So my question in the future plan you are saying, I'm happy to hear that the commitment and the capacity building part you said, but though I don't know the definition of the way you are thinking, how can you link or thinking to link Food for Peace and emergency in the ground level so that all the resources can address what Food for Peace cannot address, what emergency of the program can address? Do you have any strategy to link those two big programs together where they inter-support each other? Thank you.
That's a very good question and a very operational question, and has been a challenge historically in terms of how Food for Peace programming complements and coincides with OFDA programming. Emergency settings in particular. One of the sort of the core intents of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance is moving away from sort of the bifurcation of food and non-food and sort of coming together around, again, common problem sets and co-programming, ideally co-procuring services from partners that are complementary and targeted in a way that makes sense. I think there are a lot of examples of sort of Food for Peace dots throughout a particular region and OFDA dots throughout a particular region, and sometimes they complement and sometimes they don't. And so I think just back to the core challenge that was put before us to program humanitarian assistance in a more efficient, effective way, and also laying foundation for recovery and resilience, challenges kind of the old thing, the way that we've been doing things, the way that we've been looking at problem sets, the way that we've been investing both immediately and in the long term to move beyond sort of these silos, if you will, to really getting, seeing some real results. And so, we don't have those common procurement mechanisms yet. We're just kind of sitting next to one another at this point, and that's an important part of anticipating sort of the congressional sanctioning to move forward to get into the nitty-gritty of how do we really practically, strategically plan together, how do we coordinate our resources together more effectively, how do we co-program and design effectively. So our commitment is that we will do those things. We don't, and we recognize the issue and the problem, but it's a work in progress still. But it's a very good question or observation. I know Sudan or South Sudan is sort of ripe with those challenges as well. So.
All right, so that concludes our plenary and our Q&A. We wanted to thank everyone here for asking the questions and really, taking the time to actually think about some of these issues that were raised today. And I hope that Brian and Elizabeth have shed some light on a lot of these issues that you've been hearing about. And there's enough information in your head that you can actually go back to your headquarters and start scenario planning of when this actually does become a reality.